It was the last election broadcast before the 2017 general election. It's one of the final chances for the party to put its case to the voters. Unsurprisingly, the party made prominent use of its leader. Confounding many expectations, he had proven an effective campaigner over the past few weeks. Polls had shown his popularity rising consistently since Theresa May had called the snap election. The leader had defied his critics. He'd been front and centre of the campaign. And the rising, improving poll ratings for his party suggested that his leadership had worked. Indeed, when the final result a few days later turned out even better for his party than the polls had suggested, this was seen as very much a personal victory, and he emerged a greatly strengthened figure. Those both inside and outside the party who previously criticised his leadership either fell silent or publicly voiced praise and loyalty. Now, I'm talking, of course, about the leader of the Labour Party. Well, I'm not talking about Jeremy Corbyn. I'm actually referring to the somewhat less well-known figure, certainly outside Wales, of Carwyn Jones, First Minister and leader of Welsh Labour. Now, this one small example from the final party election broadcast by the Labour Party in Wales this year is one illustration of a much broader point. Elections are about choices. In a representative democracy, people get to choose who governs. Now, of course, there's more to it than that. In a representative democracy, elections have to be free and fair. We can argue about who the people are actually defined to be, and so who gets to vote. There are different political systems, so in parliamentary democracies we vote for members of a legislature, which in turn produces a government. In a presidential system we vote directly for the head of government. There are different electoral systems which shape how we vote and how those votes aggregate together into an election result. And of course some very important and powerful official positions like membership of constitutional courts or the leadership of central banks are not normally elected. But the basic principle remains. In a representative democracy, we, the people, choose who governs. Of course, we do not, as Karl Marx might have put it, make our choices just as we please. We choose in an election from a menu, and it's political parties that provide the options on that menu. Democracy in the UK, and pretty much everywhere else, remains a party democracy. That is, organised political movements, which we call parties, provide the overwhelming majority of candidates in major elections and an even greater share of those who actually win election. Now, of course, we don't always get the menu of options that we would like. Many people are unhappy with the available choices in many elections. There's been a big decline in faith in political parties over the last few decades in the UK and in many other established democracies. Despite recent surges for the SNP and Labour, party membership numbers have generally been falling over recent times. And in the wider electorate we see a similar picture. There are far fewer people who have a deep and abiding loyalty to any specific political party than used to be the case. And of course, unhappiness with the available choices is one reason why many people simply refuse to vote. Yet even when the available choices are unsatisfactory to many of us, this menu of electoral options still matters. But the nature of those electoral menus has changed in a fundamental way. The choices before us in the general election were once largely common across Britain. But voters in the UK's 4 nations are increasingly being presented with fundamentally different and largely disconnected sets of political options. We continue to elect one Parliament, one House of Commons, but we do so from 4 distinct electoral contests. A genuinely British democratic politics is being hollowed out. Now, why does this matter? Well, think about what unites a country. We might imagine a common language, a shared religion, perhaps a shared sense of ethnic identity. People, of course, can also become more united through facing a common enemy. But in an important sense, in a democracy, people can also be united by their differences. After all, democracy does not seek to abolish differences within a society. It merely provides for their peaceful airing and their resolution via elections and representative politics. We don't always get the governments or the policies that we want, but we all get the chance to take part in the process. And that at least may help us accept when we don't get what we want. To work, democracy ultimately depends on the loser's consent. That is, the ability of the defeated to accept both the outcome and the legitimacy of the process by which it has been reached. But this uniting through our differences can only occur if we have some sort of common political debate and common set of options. No, we don't have that. Elections become essentially a disconnected set of merely coinciding events in different parts of the country. In the worst case scenario, political debates may have so little in common that the interests of different parts of the country can seem completely unrelated to each other. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that we can have no local differences. Rural areas will have different concerns from urban ones. Rich areas will tend to worry about different things from poorer places. But the health of a political system does require some unity of political debate, of the options presented to people, and the electoral choices that they make. And in the UK, this is under increasing pressure. The UK is becoming an electorally disunited kingdom. Electoral choices have become increasingly different between the nations of Britain over the last half-century. See the long, slow decline of Scottish conservatism, the rise of the SNP, and, to a lesser extent, Plaid Cymru. This electoral disunity was shown vividly in 2017. For only the second time ever, but also the second time in a row, the general election saw 4 different parties come first in the UK's 4 nations. Prior to 2015, that had never happened before. And less widely noticed this year were other developments that pushed party politics in the UK further apart. Northern Ireland, of course, has long had a very different politics from the rest of the UK. Electorally, Ulster has always been a place apart. Yet 2017 saw the moderate forces with the closest links to the main UK parties lose their last remaining members of Parliament. In Scotland, the SNP again won the election, although much less decisively than they had 2 years previously. But the Unionist parties achieved their partial comeback by essentially fighting on the SNP's turf, albeit with some success. The defining electoral issue in Scotland was independence and whether or not there should be a second independence referendum. Even those parties that strongly believe in the United Kingdom remaining together fought an election campaign that had almost no connection at all with that happening in the rest of the UK. Wales offers a more subtle picture than the other non-English nations of the UK. Wales has long been very closely tied to its much larger neighbour to the east. But Labour's ultimately successful 2017 campaign in Wales focused almost entirely on the Welsh Labour brand. Jeremy Corbyn was almost invisible in the Labour campaigner in Wales, excluded in favour of Carwyn Jones. And after their disappointing result, many prominent Welsh Conservatives called urgently for greater autonomy for their party, for an identifiable Welsh leader. In other words, putting their party much on the model of Welsh Labour, or indeed the Scottish Conservatives. And although, of course, England and Britain are often conflated by the UK's majority nation, both the 2015 and the 2017 elections have reflected the rise in recent years of a more prominent and more politicised English identity. After the introduction of English votes for English laws in the House of Commons in 2015, all parties this year felt the need to respond to Englishness as a political phenomenon in their electoral manifestos. The Labour Party even proposed the introduction of a minister for England. So 2017 saw politics across the UK's four nations move further apart. Something that was not just a one-off, but a continuation of rather longer-term trends. If UK general elections continue on their current path, this poses fundamental problems for the long-term unity of the UK. Political unions are fragile things. This, at least, is something the citizens of the only member state ever to vote to leave the European Union ought to be able to grasp. The existence of the British state is a contingent fact. The British state's existence is neither necessary nor inevitable. Indeed, that state's history has been much more turbulent than many people realise. Those who emphasise what Churchill termed the long continuity of our institutions tend to underplay, or maybe even be unaware of, the major convulsions that have transformed the fundamental shape of politics in these islands, roughly once a century since the time of Henry VIII. So Henry's formal incorporation of Wales into the Kingdom of England early in the 16th century was followed at the beginning of the 17th century by the union of the English and Scottish crowns, by the formal parliamentary union of Scotland and England in 1707, and a similar union between Ireland and Britain in 1800. Then, of course, in 1922, we saw the independence of 26 of Ireland's 32 counties as the Irish Free State. It's often forgotten that only 95 years ago, the UK lost a greater proportion of its core territory through Irish independence than Germany had just a few years previously through the Treaty of Versailles. And just 3 years ago, the UK dodged what was not so much another bullet as a large piece of artillery munition when very close to half of those voting in Scotland opted for independence. The political history of what is now the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is not remotely the story of stability and tranquility that many would like to think. Now, the UK may continue to stay together. Fragmentation is not inevitable. But the absence of a genuinely British party politics to help tie things together certainly pushes things in the opposite direction. We could end up not merely as an electorally disunited kingdom. The end of British party politics could well mean the end of Britain itself.